Before you install SharePoint 2010, you need to gather some prerequisites that you'll need before the install and some that will be utilized during the install. You'll need to identify the DNS name that SharePoint will use, logon information for the SharePoint accounts, SQL Server instance name. Unless you're doing a standalone install, then SQL will be installed at that time. SMTP server to use for outgoing email, so alerts can be sent and so on. In addition, you're going to need Windows 2008 Service Pack 2 or later, 80 gig of free space, and we'll go into more detail on that shortly, 8 gig of physical memory in a production environment, and most likely in your test environment, but in a dev box you could drop it down, but Microsoft doesn't recommend going below 8 gig. And 64-bit quad cores. This also applies for the dev box. You can certainly use dual core if you're using it as a standalone test environment. NTFS file system without compression. Finally, the server will need to be prepared by installing the following components. Application server, you'll need to install the IIS role, SMTP service, and you'll also need to have .NET installed, .NET 3.0. It's a requirement of SharePoint. Understanding installation options. There are several options that you have to choose from. You have your basic installation. It's for demonstration modes, used if you're going out to work with clients and you need to demonstrate some of the different features within SharePoint. Advanced. That also is a standalone. A lot of companies will use this specifically for the developers, so they have an environment where they can develop their code and the features that they want to incorporate into SharePoint. And then you have the complete installation that installs everything more for a test in a production environment. There is also unattended. That's a script that comes with the SharePoint installation files that you can modify so it will do the installation without any user interface. Primarily used for large farms where multiple servers need to be configured. Standalone server. As we discussed a moment ago, staging and development environments primarily. You can certainly use less RAM and dual core for these environments so you don't need so many resources. Situations where licensing SharePoint is impractical. It could be an MSDN license. It could be trial software that you're using specifically for a particular demo. And physical isolation for security reasons. You may have it out in your DMZ for external access, and you want to keep it completely separate from the rest of your SharePoint environments. Limitations for SharePoint Foundation. Limited feature set. You will not have as many features as you will in the server version. For comparisons, go to Microsoft.com for a list of comparisons between the different licensed versions. SQL and SharePoint compete for resources because they're all on one box. They're going to be competing back and forth. All data is stored on C by default. You don't get an option during the installation process to change that directory. Small farm includes one web front end and one SQL server. WFE, which is the web front end, is also going to play the role of the application server. It'll do both. You can add additional WFEs as needed. It is the most common installation. A medium farm consists of multiple servers, 2 web front ends, and a SQL instance. You can add additional WFEs to the farm. It can also be installed from a public share. Must use the same version of SharePoint. I can't add an additional SharePoint server to the farm if it's running a different version. For instance, if I have a SharePoint server farm and I want to add a server to the farm that is a foundation server that doesn't have all the bells and whistles, I wouldn't be able to do that. They have to run on the same version, have the same cumulative updates and service packs also. Simplifies updates in the future. A large farm will consist of multiple WFEs. It can also have multiple application servers that play specific roles. For instance, you may have an application server dedicated solely to search and a SQL cluster. You can create a setup script to do an unattended install. It's provided with the SharePoint installation package. Simplifies deployment. ensures consistency across servers. You can also use the PSConfig utilities during the installation. The PSConfig utility performs the second part of the install, the part that's referred to as the configuration wizard. The initial install, when you run the setup, is going to install the binaries in the appropriate location. Once that is done, then the PSConfig utility starts doing its part, and that's where the configuration wizard comes in. It's installed by setup. When you finish installing the binaries, you'll be prompted to run the configuration wizard, and you can choose to or not to. There are different parameters that are available. We won't go into all of them right here, but for instance, the config DB, it attaches the WFE to a configuration database. This installs the SharePoint user help. Secure resources secures folders and registry keys. Services registers installed services and sets them online. Install features registers features included in the product. There are multiple features, and you may choose to go ahead and have those registered and available. Admin VS, that installs or uninstalls the central administration site, which is where you will perform most of your work. Application content copies shared application content to an existing web application. So let's go ahead and start the installation process so you can see the different items that we've been talking about. Let's get started with installing our SharePoint Server 2010 edition. I've already downloaded the trial software from Microsoft that they provide. It comes with a trial license key. At any point after it's installed, you can convert it to a full-blown licensed version just by entering the key in Central Administration. Once you've downloaded it, double-click it to start the install process. The first step in the installation process is installing the software prerequisites. You'll click on the link under the Install category. It's going to open up a dialog window. It's going to show you all of the items that you're going to be installing. It's going to go out, download them, and install them as part of this process. Click Next. Accept the terms. Next again. And now just sit back and wait for a couple of minutes as it works through its process. The preparation tool is now finished installing the prerequisites. Validate the installation has completed without any errors. It should say installation complete, and then click Finish. The server is now ready for SharePoint to be installed. Let's go ahead and start that process. Click Install SharePoint Server. Enter the license key provided by Microsoft, and then click Continue. Accept the terms. Continue. It is recommended when choosing a file location that you not put it on the same drive as the operating system is installed in. You will want to make sure that you do move it over to a different location. Go ahead and click Install Now. Okay, now that the binaries have been installed, the next step is to run the configuration wizard. Make sure the checkbox is selected and go ahead and tell it Close. The configuration wizard opens. Welcome to SharePoint Products. It's going to ask you the name of the database server, the farm, username, password for database access. Go ahead and click Next. And you'll be prompted because certain services are going to be restarted during this process. IIS, the admin service for SharePoint, and the timer service. Go ahead and tell it Yes. If you're going to be installing this server to be added to an existing farm, you would go ahead and select Connection or Connect to an existing server farm. If this is a new fresh farm, click Create New Server Farm. Next. To specify configuration database settings window opens, go ahead and type in the database server. and specify the database access account. Then click Next. The passphrase. This is a farm-specific passphrase. Anytime you want to add additional servers to the farm, you will need to know what this passphrase is to do it. And you cannot change this via any GUI interface like Central Admin. It can only be done by the PowerShell scripts. It'll ask you to confirm it, and then click Next. Specify a port, or it'll just pick any random port. You can also configure the security settings. By default, it's set to NTLM as your authentication provider. We're going to leave it at that for this exercise or for this demonstration. But you can choose Kerberos. There are some additional things that need to be done to do that. Go ahead and tell it Next. It's going to confirm the settings, the database server, the database name. Is this going to host the central administration web application since it's the first server in the farm? Yes. It'll show you what the URL is going to be, that port that it was based on that we selected earlier, and the authentication provider is NTLM. Keep in mind, if you would have chosen Kerberos and it wasn't configured properly, by default it'll back down to NTLM. Now that the configuration is complete, it should come up and say configuration successful and revalidate the settings that you chose. If everything looks good, go ahead and click Finish. By clicking Finish, it's going to start the central administration website. It takes a couple of minutes for it to load initially because it's the first time. The first thing it's going to ask is to help make SharePoint better. Do you want to be part of their customer experience improvement program? So it'll automatically upload error reports and so on. I'm going to say no, I do not wish to participate, and tell it OK. Then it's going to ask you, do you want to go through Start the Wizard? You can choose the wizard if you don't have a lot of experience with SharePoint, although it's not highly recommended to install your service applications and features this way because you don't have any control over what they're going to be named. It's going to use the GUID as part of the name, which makes it a little bit more complicated to identify. So for our purposes, we're going to choose no. I will configure everything myself. Click Cancel. And now this is Central Administration. SharePoint is now installed, and you are good to go to start configuring the different components. Uninstalling SharePoint 2010. Use Setup to uninstall SharePoint. One of the options that you will be prompted with is to uninstall, and the other is to repair. Choose whichever is appropriate. It does not remove the databases. It's just going to remove and uninstall the SharePoint components, but the databases will still be there.